Hey everyone. So welcome back for those that have been to our etc. talks before, and obviously to those that are regularly here for our online drawing sessions. But for those that are here for the first time, welcome to our etc. artist talks. So these are monthly talks that we're doing at the moment, and this is the second of our year's talks. So it's heading part of our autumn term. So for the next 3 months, we're going to have a particular focus on graphite, and our etc. talks are all featuring artists that work in graphite as part of their larger practice. So we had Leggy Gordon talking last month, and we're really lucky to have Meg Buick talking this month. So thank you all for joining us for this lovely next hour where we're going to be able to hear a little bit about Meg's work and see some of the images that she's sharing with us. We're particularly going to focus on the role of drawing in her practice, although she has a much broader practice than that. And actually, maybe Meg, it might be nice to hear just about some of the breadth of your practice early on. But just first of all, I just want to say thank you to all of our Patreon supporters that have helped to fund this talk and our program of talks. If you did want to support future sessions, you can support for any amount of money, or you can just come along to these free sessions, and we're just delighted to be able to share them for free with everybody. So we'll put the recording from this session up publicly available afterwards if you wanted to come back to it. And also, we will share all of our future talks as well, and they're intended to be free and open to everybody to make them as accessible as possible. But this is a really lovely opportunity for us to dive a little bit deeper into specific artists' work, and also to hopefully introduce you to some artists you might not know, or to some of the work of artists that you are familiar with that we might not see on Instagram, or just to get a bit more context to that work. So in a moment, I'm going to switch over to Meg, and I'm going to give her the opportunity to unmute because I've just muted everybody. And then we'll launch in. So Meg, do feel free to unmute yourself. And I'll pop up your slideshow shortly, but I didn't know if you just wanted to say hello to everyone first.
Yeah, hi. My name's Meg, and I work across painting, drawing, and printmaking. And I don't see them as being that different in a way, but I do feel like drawing is kind of very foundational in both of the other disciplines, and that's a little bit what I wanted to talk about today.
Thank you. Shall I launch into our slideshow?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, yeah, let's go.
Be a good moment.
I'm starting with this image, which is a few drawings that I made while doing the drawing year at the Royal Drawing School, which was called the Prince's Drawing School then. And um, if you just go back to the first one, it was a very intense year of drawing, and it was really important to me in kind of starting to take drawing really seriously and starting to take myself seriously as an artist. And I wanted to open with these um, particular drawings because although it wasn't the beginning of my journey as an artist, it felt like the start of this moment when I really started to draw. And um, I hadn't gone to art school. I'd kind of gone to a few degree shows and seen a lot of conceptual sculpture and video installation and that kind of thing, which is fine. But I knew that I really wanted to draw and paint, and I didn't want to be kind of pushed into doing that. So I worked instead and did a lot of evening classes and a lot of life drawing classes, and I would also draw a lot from, buy art books in secondhand shops and draw a lot from those. And this became a big part of what I was doing as well. I'd, spend a lot of time drawing from Rembrandt etchings, for example. I didn't really know why, but I sort of felt that was a good way to learn. And when I got to the drawing school, it kind of made sense to me that I'd done that because a big part of what students do there is drawing out in London in the collections in the National Gallery and the British Museum and places like that. And that really, I think, fed and nourished my work and kind of continues to do so. But we also drew outside in London a lot, and this is where these two drawings were made. And these were taught by the writer and artist Tim Hyman, who's recently died. And I think a lot of people think from outside the drawing school that it's a kind of training in classical realism, that you're going to be doing like endless life drawings to make these really naturalistic, realistic drawings. And actually, it's very different to that. And I think in Tim's class, I really realised how free drawing could be. Um, he he would always say, "Why are you doing anatomy classes? Why are you doing perspective? You just need to really look." And this was the sort of way of drawing that I kind of developed then for myself, which was about just standing in one place and really just looking at everything and putting things in, and putting things in quite fast without worrying too much about them, and then covering them up and building up. And I think it's a moment when I felt my drawing kind of really start to free up. So if you go on to the next slide. Um, and another course that we did there was drawing from paintings at the National Gallery. And I think I didn't used to really understand the National Gallery, but I really got to love it there from drawing there every week. And one of the courses was drawing from the same painting over a long period of time. And this was painting by the early Renaissance artist Piero della Francesca of the Nativity. These are two details from a larger drawing I made of that scene. Um, and I think this process of drawing from art and then letting those kind of drawings evolve and become something else, and using motifs from those drawings to create my own landscapes and narratives started here at this point when I was drawing a lot from these Renaissance paintings, and they've kind of carried on feeding my work in a way. Um, so um, if you go to the next slide, this is another example of that. Um, these are just little studies that have come out of paintings by Piero de Francesca that were made kind of over the, few year period. It's an artist I keep coming back to. And um, they kind of have a role in a way in the landscapes that I'm looking for and the images I'm trying to create. Um, so you go on to the next slide. This was a drawing I made probably around the end of the time when I was studying there. And this is a kind of process that I've kind of carried on working with really, which is to make a monotype. So if it's a printmaking process, but you have the plate, which is basically I use like a clear perspex sheet so you can see through it, rolled up with ink, and then, so it's completely covered in ink, and then using a rag to take away. So everywhere that you've left the ink, you kind of get these quite painterly marks, and then you put damp paper on the plate and put it through the press, and that's the monotype. So it's a kind of printmaking process where you only get one image. Um, and I came across these Degas monotypes, which I think he really kind of pioneered this way of working, where he makes monotype and then works into it with pastel. And this really connected with me, this kind of way of working where you're layering up materials and kind of somewhere in between, kind of hybrid of painting and drawing, I guess. So this is an example of the work I started at that time, which was sort of monotype with pastel, and then graphite drawing into the monotypes and into the marks, and then building up again with um, white watercolor and so on. And it's a process that I still use a lot. Today I've kind of used on and off for years, and I think it particularly encapsulates that idea of painting and printmaking and drawing kind of all being used together and connecting to each other. So if you go, yeah, go on.
That's what I can ask, because so when you're working on an image that uses these kind of layers of different ways of looking, are you kind of planning how it's going to work, how the image is going to work, or are you sort of taking cues from the process itself as well, and sort of layering different things on to experiment with how they're going to resolve?
Yeah, good question. I do normally have a bit of an idea, but I mean, I think with this one, for example, I just did a lot of paths. It kind of, I don't know if you've done that process, but when you're dragging the rag across the plate, it really invites these kind of like cloud kind of path type marks. And then you can make quite a lot and then work on them later at different stages. So I sort of did different landscapes with different ones, and like with this kind of thing, for example, I wouldn't necessarily know till I started drawing into it that I was going to put horses and this figure in. I would, and that's one thing I actually really love about pencil, is that you can kind of put things in and then take them out again. It can kind of go back and forward a little bit. And you can do that with paint as well, of course, but it's takes longer. You have to wait for it to dry and then paint it out again, or the whole handling of the paint has its own problems. But with pencil, with something like this, I probably would have started putting in the horses and seen whether it worked or not. And if I hadn't liked them, I would have taken them out again. And so generally, no, I don't quite know where the image is going until something starts to work, and then I'll kind of take it in that direction, I suppose. And obviously, there's those that work less well, and they work more well. I guess that's the nature of it. Um, yeah. Does that answer?
And oh, yeah, no, that's a wonderful answer. Um, and I wondered with the horses and the figures and the kind of repeated motifs that appear in different kind of iterations in your work. Like, are you developing that as a kind of body of imagined motifs, or is it something borrowed from other artists' work or from observation? Like, what's your reference for things like the horses and the figure?
For something like these horses and figures, I don't actually use a reference now because I'm familiar with, I've got enough of a kind of images in my mind to just sort of draw them. Um, but yeah, I mean, I will use references for things when I'm not, if I'm trying to create an image, um, and I haven't got it enough in my mind, then I'll use other references from like all kinds of different things. Um, and yeah, and I mean, this motif has come back again and again of the horses and figures and things, and even when I think I'm not going to do an image like that, it sort of seems to happen somehow. So I
They
sort of,
wander in the
yeah, they
landscape.
wander in. So yeah, is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you go on to the next slide, I just wanted to briefly mention etching, which has been kind of like a parallel part of my drawing practice, since probably since I started the drawing school and a little bit before. And it's a completely different process to drawing, as in it's not at all immediate. It's incredibly laborious and very slow, and lots of people hate it because it goes wrong about 90% of the time. But when it goes well, it goes really well. You get these really beautiful marks that you can't get in any other way. Um, and yeah, I do feel as different as it is from drawing. I feel like the drawing practice is very connected to it, and that the whole way of making the images and drawing has kind of been quite a key part of the approach I've had as a printmaker, which is, I think, has been about not getting too bogged down with the kind of technical side of the process, but really focusing on ways that you can make images directly onto the plate. So these are all sugar lift, which is where you can paint directly onto the plate with a kind of sugar solution rather than um, other processes where you have to kind of use a lot more pressure, and um, they become a little bit more static. So that this is kind of one side of my printmaking practice, which I might talk a little bit more about later on. Um, if you go to the next image, um, and this is a lithograph, so another printmaking process, slightly different to etching, which I don't do as much of now. It's quite hard to find studios that do lithography now. And I just, wanted to share this image and the following image, if you go on to the next slide, because animals have come up a lot in my work, and it's kind of not something I've necessarily chosen, a little bit like I was saying before in answer to your question. Um, and I've sort of slightly resisted it in a way because there's so many like very sentimental images of animals in art, but actually I've sort of had to accept that it's a subject matter that I kind of feel very drawn to. Um, and um, the short story writer, I think it's Flannery O'Connor, said a writer can't choose what a writer can choose what subjects he writes about, but he cannot choose what subjects he can make live. And I think that's quite an interesting thing in terms of finding your subject matter, and what you want to draw and paint is finding the subject that you can really bring to life. And I think um, for me, I've had to find a lot of the time that it is a lot of it, painting and landscapes I make, they'll have this animal motif coming through. So over the years, I've made this, kind of keep often coming back to these kind of single image of animals, almost this kind of archetypal, like single image, particularly the bottom left one is not intentionally, but it's kind of often seen as being reminiscent of kind of cave painting, and that's going right back to the very early images of animals that people have made. The earliest images we have, most of them are of animals, going up to like much more modern sources. And I find that's another sort of bank of images that I've kept going back to, and I've found has been really good for me in terms of subject matter, is to find something I just really love to draw, and to return to it in lots of different mediums. So yeah, if you go on to the next slide. Um, yeah, so um, one thing I thought a lot about in terms of the role of drawing in my practice was that it's easy to give the impression that I'm always making the kind of drawing from life every day, and um, I would like to be. And on the drawing year, it's such an unusual time because I don't see how you could ever really do that again. But we really were drawing everything all the time. We did loads of different classes in the city and museums and galleries, life drawing. portraits, you were drawing everything all the time, and it's very intense. And then in the period after studying, I got much more into the printmaking, as I've said. And I think in a way, there's been periods where I've got really bogged down in trying to make the images and I've sort of forgotten about drawing. And when I say drawing, I kind of mean particularly like that sort of drawing from life or observational drawing, whatever you want to call it, where you're really just sitting down and looking and really just trying to draw something for the sake of drawing, like to love the process of drawing rather than to make an image that you're going to do something else with. And I think I lost that a little bit on and off at different times. And whenever I come back to it and start drawing again, it's always really good. And I remember like, drawing's the thing that you really need. And one obvious kind of period for me, in terms of coming back to drawing was lockdown, which I think was obviously significant for loads of people in different ways. But for me, I was, at home with a young child and I couldn't paint or do any printmaking anymore. And I started looking at Richard Diebenkorn's sketchbooks, and I was so inspired by the way that he, even at the height of his career as an abstract artist, he still had this drawing practice where he was, doing these kind of scrappy sketchbook drawings of, things on the table and things in the museum, sort of anything again. And so I think I just decided to sit down and just draw an apple one day, and I felt like I hadn't done anything like that for ages, just to sit and really draw an object that I wasn't going to do anything with, or like I wasn't trying to make a more important image out of, but just to draw. And it was really grounding. So um, if you go on to the next slide, I just thought I'd share a few of these. I just decided to do a drawing a day for a couple of months. Whenever I had time during the day, I would just draw. And they obviously, at the beginning, I was just drawing an apple, but then, I'd get interested in set up a more complex scene, or started to, draw things on a windowsill looking outside, and set up more and more things to draw. But I just tried to draw something that was in front of me, I suppose. And it was so grounding, and I'm really grateful for that time, because it reminded me what a role drawing has in everything else. I think it stops me kind of flying away into the ideas and the images. If you go on to the next image.
Can I ask
Yeah.
about the diagonal eraser marks in these two drawings?
Yeah.
Um, I just wondered. I think like they're adding a real sense of, I don't know, kind of it's stopping it being just a photographic image, just a flat image. It sort of looks like they're speaking about something beyond just looking, but they're speaking about something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, I've always drawn a lot with a rubber. I sort of take it for granted really. I draw and rub out and build that up. And then I think I was always interested when I drew things on the windowsill, I was always interested in the changing light,
Mm.
um, because when you draw for a long time it's moving, you kind of have to commit to one direction of light. And in like a very like practical basic way, I was, rubbing out in the direction of the light a lot of the time because I found that reinforced that sense of light, and then drawing back in. But also, I mean, I just love anything with graphite where you get those like really kind of painterly marks, those really sort of fugitive, soft, painterly marks. And I think that's um another reason I sort of use the rubber a lot with drawing, is because it takes it almost into painting in a way. Some of these I'll put like poppy oil and things in as well they get more painterly. Um, so yeah, it's probably it's like a habit of mine, I think.
So how would you use the poppy oil in a drawing?
I mean, you can just like paint it on with a tiny brush, or you can, you put it across the whole of the paper to begin with and then draw into it. It makes it much darker. It's really satisfying, when you draw into it. The graphite just comes out much darker, and you kind of move it around on the page a little bit. And um, yeah, it's just a nice sort of add-on for pencil, I think.
Mhm.
The pencil kind of skids across the paper, it sort of changes the way you draw slightly. And I think that's always good to find little things that change the way you handle the pencil or anything you're familiar with, to kind of change it slightly and see what happens.
Because you've got a wonderfully varied visual language here. I mean, there's such a wide vocabulary of marks that you're using in a single drawing. You must be changing your pencil hold quite a lot with that.
Yeah, I think I do, and that's something I'll definitely try and get people to do when I'm teaching drawing a lot, is to change the way they're holding the pencil.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I love Bonnard drawings. He's a big inspiration to me, and I honestly don't know how he gets the range of marks he gets in his drawings, because when you actually look at them, they just don't make any sense. They're sort of not possible. Um, so so yeah, I think I'm very inspired by those. And I mean, these drawings, I'd never do anything with them really. They're just sort of still life. It was so out of my kind of subject matter really, and that was also quite liberating as well. Um, and then yeah, if you look on the next um, slide, um, I also got back into this sort of way of drawing that I hadn't done for ages, where it's sort of about trying to draw a whole sense of space within a room, where you pick one object, like say an orange, and then you measure everything else. You draw that, and then you everything else you draw, you measure really carefully in comparison to that. It's an exercise, but it's about trying to get a sense of space within the drawing. And I think that's something weird that drawing does that photography doesn't really do. It has a different quality of space when you make a kind of spatial drawing. It has a different feel of space. You couldn't just take a photograph and get the same thing, I think. And that's something I hadn't done for ages, just try and make these kind of spatial drawings, I suppose, which you can spend ages on, and it's really satisfying, when you get it, I think.
Do kind of exercises as a routine play a big role in your work, or in
No,
your
not at all.
kind
I
of
mean, that's kind of what I'm saying. It's like I never did stuff like this. It was just sort of this weird thing during lockdown where I was like, right, I'm going to just start properly drawing again in a way that I hadn't really done since maybe a residency I'd done 2 years before, or like, mostly I'm not really drawing in this way. I'm sort of doing other image making related things. So yeah, I think it was good. I should probably do it again now, to be honest. But you forget, don't you? And then,
And with that sense of space, what kind of scale are these? Are they relatively small drawings?
like A3, A2, something like that. Yeah. Not massive because you have to do them from life, so you've got to have it sort of in front of you. Um, yeah, and then this kind of, obviously after a while I did a lot of still lifes, and then it naturally evolved into making other images again. So if you go on to the next slide, um, this was then kind of getting back into drawing from art again, but these are both from, this is a Lorenzetti, I think, painter from Siena, little detail from a painting, and then a George Stubbs painting. So I just had loads of art books, and when I'd done all my still lifes, I was like still drawing, So I started just drawing from the books again, but treating the drawings like paintings, not trying to make a replica of what I was, of not trying to recreate the exact thing, but just using it as a starting point, and then seeing how much I could um, make them into these sort of paintings that evolved. So again, there's probably some like poppy oil or linseed oil or something in these, and um, you know, I'll use like varnish and other things to sort of just try and find ways to get into this almost this paint language with drawing.
How would you characterize the difference between a drawing and a painting for you?
I mean, I think I think it's a lot to do with the surface, like the paper. I think is part of it. The fact that the paper is the light in a drawing. I feel like there's once you start putting white paint on, there's a certain point when it kind of goes a bit into the language of paint. It's a much more opaque language. But I suppose what I mean when I say kind of painterly drawing is partly they're very tonal, I guess, but also just that um, that possibility of moving something around after you've done it, kind of constantly adjusting and changing something, I feel is sort of close to the quality of paint. In the same way charcoal, I think, is almost like paint when you use it in that way. The possibility to make like very broad tonal sweeps and then to change them again quite rapidly and respond to them. But I mean, in a way, it doesn't matter. It's just sort of different words for things, I suppose. And oh yeah, just go to the next slide. This is just a few more examples of um, like drawings made at that time that were kind of coming out of this sort of still life period and going back in a little bit to discovering my own subject matter. Um, and yeah, I think that was just the kind of something I've tried to hold on to really. If you go to the next slide, um, these are more recent drawings, and since then I've kind of tried a bit more to make sure I do keep up a sketchbook practice that's much more like regular in a way, and don't get too lost in paintings, because I think that drawing um, has this way of like tuning your mind to the right frequency to do everything else. So even if you're just drawing an apple on the table and you think like that's not my subject matter, well, I mean this is for me, I think it tunes the mind to that kind of frequency that you need, and I find that all of the other work kind of goes better and flows better just from the actual process itself of drawing. Um, and go to the next slide. Oh yeah, and this is just like drawings that I've made of my kids. I'd like to draw them more, but they're always running around and like I don't. I, but there's like moments. I mean, I didn't actually, this lots of these ones I sort of finish later. Really, they start off as a little sketch, and then I'll finish them later from memory. Um, and that's important to me as well to try and keep up um, this kind of process of drawing, even if it's something that's made briefly and then taken away and finished later, just because I think there's a quality to something that's when the initial thing is made from life and then the rest is like imagined or remembered. I think that's a kind of particular quality in a drawing that I love. And again, very inspired by Bonnard drawings. I mean, his drawings are all made from life and then his paintings are made in that way. He never paints from life. It's very much like the drawings are made from life and then taken to the studio to paint from. And I'm really interested in that idea of what you bring to something from memory, and what gets lost and what remains. Um, uh,
So the paper becomes a space for organizing those things and exploring them, the
yeah,
observation, imagination.
yeah, exactly. And I think that's so amazing, that what you have, if you draw with pencil and paper, what you can kind of get into, and it's so special the things you've recorded in drawing because you just remember them in such a different way when you've really looked at something, right? You kind of have a completely different um, relationship to it, I guess. All the paintings I've drawn from, if I go to the National Gallery, you kind of know the ones you've drawn even briefly because you really look at something when you draw it in a way that you don't um, in any other way, I think. Um, and uh, yeah, if you go on to the next slide, I think this is just more, yeah, just more examples of the sort of different routes that the drawing leads to. So this on the left is a soft ground etching, which is very close to drawing. You kind of cover the copper plate with a sort of waxy ground and then draw into it. Um, but the etching kind of takes it into a different language again. And then on the left is a sketchbook drawing, which is worked into with oil paint and white watercolor and all these things you're probably not supposed to mix together too much, but I find tend to be okay as long as you don't, you know, you sell them for like thousands and thousands of pounds. Um, little bits of oil paint in the sketchbook and things like that. I kind of like to find ways to start to have a sketchbook which is quite painterly, where you kind of start as a drawing and then you're working into it and um, building it back up. Um,
And where all the pages stick together, I imagine.
Oh my yeah, yeah. I mean, I try the oil paint's really thin. That's how I get away with it. And yeah, and I use a white oil pastel as well. I really like that for kind of covering up and then drawing back into. So that sort of helps with that problem a bit. But yeah, the sketchbooks can get a bit like that. Um, and
What is the sketchbook a personal space for you? Is it something you share with people?
I would share it with people, but it's definitely just for me, really. Yeah, it's but I like, I'd like to be more scrappy with them. I think, like I said, I was looking at the Diebenkorn, this book of collection of all his sketchbooks recently, and he's really scrappy with it. I don't know. I feel like I'm still a bit. I want mine. I like to make each page beautiful. I suppose I get really, I see them as like a little. Not every page, but I love the idea. I'd like to make a whole sketchbook that's just painting, paintings in a sketchbook. I just love that idea of a book format for paintings.
Mhm.
So I try. No, my sketchbooks are kind of a bit scrappy, but I think it's probably better to be less to care less about them, I think. And, somehow I still get really into like each page as a thing, just almost like the book as an object. Um, yeah, so I mean if you go to the next image, this is just more sketchbook images. Um, and again, just like objects on the table, um, sketches of my children that sort of then have imagined elements as well. And I I think one thing I was thinking about drawing is that it's just so mysterious. And I think one of the things that's most mysterious about it is how difficult it is. It's just really, drawing is actually really hard. And you can kind of imagine a parallel universe where everyone could just like take a pencil and paper and like roughly transcribe accurately what they saw. But we're so far from that. Like people, um, once you lose the innocence of childhood drawing, like, and you start drawing again, and I see this all the time when I'm teaching, um, it's really hard. People are sort of embarrassed by their drawings because, if you stop drawing when you're a child, that's where your drawing kind of stops. And we have this idea that we should just be able to represent things, and actually, it's really difficult. Um, but that's because drawing isn't just transcribing the world. There's something more mysterious about it. It's sort of stranger about it in a way. And if you go on to the next image, um, this is. I was just thinking this is just an example of that kind of mystery of drawing, because the drawing on the left is a Seurat drawing, which I really love his drawings. There's a really nice book of all of his drawings, which are Conte, made with Conte crayon on like quite wove paper, and he's got this incredible way of building up the darks and the lights. That line that's kind of twisting around and um, building up and up and up till he gets these really deep blacks. But in this drawing, you can see a kind of like really classic device, which is that the figure nearest to us has a high contrast. The dark head with the white, the sky's slightly whiter around his head, and then the light trousers against the dark landscape, and then the figure behind has a lot lower contrast. So you've got the light grey sky and the sort of slightly darker figure. Um, this is like a device you can sort of talk about in drawing is contrast used in this way, and yet there's no formula with drawing. It's like poetry. You can't just teach a list of formulas, of devices that are used to create these illusions. It's so much more than just creating an illusion. There's something sort of weird and mysterious about drawings, and why some of them work and why some of them don't. Um, and why we like certain drawings, and obviously that's completely subjective from person to person. And this, same thing with the Bonnard drawing that I mentioned before as well. Why is it that his marks, every mark that he's using becomes part of energizing the drawing? It's not about creating an illusion like a perfect um, kind of apple that you could feel like you could just pick up off the table, but yet we kind of believe this sort of dream of the drawing that it's there from these marks, and I find that so interesting. Um, yes, if you go on to the next one, um, this is kind of more recent work, which is going back to that monotype process which I talked about earlier, where you're you can really work on the plates covered in ink, and you can really take away and build up. And I find that's kind of been an ongoing sort of way of working for me. And again, you can kind of see there's sort of pastel and other things going on, and I try and sort of trust the process a little bit with monotype. And I think you have to make lots, because there's a sort of, as with all printmaking, there's like such an element of surprise, and more often disappointment, because you looks really good on the plate sometimes, and you hold it up to the light and you think, oh, it's gonna be a really good one, and then you pull it off the press and it just doesn't work. Um, but when, again, like I said about etching, when they work, they have this other kind of mark making thing that you can't really get in another way. So I've carried on with that process. And there's another, if you go on to the next slide, there's um, other images. These are all made in this way, pretty much monotype and pastel and pencil. And then I'll also often use kind of like varnishes and stains on the paper as well, and use those to kind of go slightly into other colours and kind of create this kind of colour landscape for the rest of the painting. Um, and yeah, if you go to I think this is my um, final slide. I was going to talk a little bit about the kind of colour printmaking work that I'm doing now as well, because I recently got funding from Quest, which is the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Trust, and part of that was to do a training with a master craftsperson. So I'm doing a training with a printmaker called Terence Millington, who's down in Stroud. And I mean, look up his work because it's incredible. It's like very, very perfect, like beautiful still life, like full color etchings. They look like paintings. Yeah, very kind of naturalistic, realistic, really beautiful, but completely different to my work. But I kind of wrote a proposal to start to work in etching in color, which I'm slightly terrified about because, like I said, etching takes so long already just doing it in one color. But I'm really excited by the possibility of starting to work in color in etching. And this on the right is the first image that I made with Terry. So I've got to go down in kind of like sort of blocks of time to work with him because it's quite far away from where I am. Um, and this is a whole other kind of way of thinking. I don't know if you do um, printmaking, but it's been really interesting for me to try and get my head around the kind of layering up of more than one color on the plate. And it's so different to how I work, which is quite intuitive and kind of making decisions as they go along quite a lot. You can't really do that with this kind of etching because you have to stick to one. Once you've made the kind of key plate, you've got to make sure everything else lines up with that. So that's been quite interesting. And yeah, I'm looking forward to carrying on that and seeing what emerges. And then the other medium that I've started to work with more, which is the one on the left, is egg tempera, which is like, just egg yolk as the binder for any water-based paint, really. But I find that's been really good for um, painting with young kids because it's non-toxic and I can't, it's really easy to clean up and it dries like in seconds. So you can, it's sort of not really like oil paint, but it's a little bit more like oil paint somehow than um, than some other processes. So I'm really enjoying being able to make kind of quite quick paintings and then them dry instantly and then paint again over them. So that's the kind of other color work that I'm going into that's kind of going alongside that, I guess. Um,
And what's your relationship to color in image making? Like how do you think about using it? What's the kind of role that it's playing in your images?
yeah, I mean, I just have I was always taught to paint with like, a warm and a cool of each primary, so six colors and then white and I've kind of stuck with that and then introduced but then I have a lot of earth colors as well, so you can probably tell. So I always have that kind of like six palette warm cool thing, and then I have um, the earth colors, which I probably just use most intuitively as well. So I do think I've gone through phases of thinking a lot about color, and then not so much. And I've really enjoyed thinking about color. You know, I find it so fascinating, um, just mixing color and like understanding color, and it's helped me a lot to sort of understand warm and cool and so on for color mixing and things. That's helped me a lot. But now I'd say I do it more intuitively. Um, and you know, you go through little phases, don't you? Where you have like a color that you always use, and then it goes a bit out of your. Maybe you run out, and then you get another one. So I think I'm most comfortable with kind of earth color, I would say. And I think if you work with earth colors, like a raw sienna, yellow ochre's a yellow, and burnt sienna, raw umber, Indian red is the red, and then ultramarine is the blue, something like that with white, then you naturally, they'd work together, then, it's easier to harmonize them. So in some ways, I'll think a lot about it. In other ways, I just have sort of palettes that I'm happy with the harmonies they create, and then that sort of takes care of itself.
And it seems that you're working with opacity and transparency in that process as well, because there's quite a contrast between lots of transparent color in your work where the white of the paper is really coming through, and then these very clear shapes and blocks of opaque color over the top to give clarity to everything.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't thought about it like that before, but yeah, I think that's true. And I definitely have a kind of tendency to like, I mean, this is something you can't really do in etching so much, but in drawing and painting, and particularly the monotype process I was using before, I like to draw things and then kind of cover them up again, and then draw back in. That kind of process of being able to build something up um, is just feels very natural to me, I suppose. And I think, I'm very sensitive to texture, and so I'd love to be able to like paint something in white watercolor and then like scribble back into it, and you get different quality of mark on then you get drawing into paper and then oil pastel into that, and you can and scribbling into that again. And I find I'm very drawn to um, not for the sake of texture, just I suppose it's something I just naturally am drawn to is how to have this range of um, sort of ways of changing your marks. And I mean, it's like a journey I'm just right at the beginning of. I think is like just finding the marks and the materials that meet with your particular voice and subject matter in the way that you envisage. I think. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, and I think you're moving around a subject that I kind of really worry about sometimes when people talk about style and sort of say like, have I got a style? Am I developing a style? How do I develop a style? I always think it's a really problematic word and sort of pursuit. Whereas I think what you're talking about is a set of inclinations and tendencies that maybe unify your practice but don't constrain it. And do you come across that in teaching at all when people are pursuing?
Yeah, yeah. I think everyone, including me, really has this big expectation that
Oh
they'll
yeah.
one day like find their style and it'll be like this thing. Um, and yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. I think almost it's a bit like how no one thinks they've got an accent. Like I feel like no one thinks they've got a style. Like you don't see your own
Hmm.
style in a way. Um, and obviously, like I think that's how your style. I think the word style. I don't know. Maybe that's like it's not always the best word, but I think the way your so-called style develops is through making mistakes. That's what I always try and say to people. It's when you do something you didn't want to do, and then you think, "Oh, I quite like that." That over years and years is how you find your style, like your particular way you want to work. But it's always from accidents, isn't it? From like something you didn't expect to happen. Um, you don't. That's how you discover the kind of marks you want to make. And then obviously, of course, from like looking a lot at work that you like and all of that kind of thing, that becomes part of it. Yeah.
It's always interesting to kind of find the Venn diagram of sort of how work that you look at overlaps with work that you make naturally, so the kinds of marks that you might make in response to something, what you might do when you're observationally drawing, and then the materials you like using. And then somewhere in the middle of all of that, there is the work that seems to work best that you've made, that's
Yeah.
the result.
Yeah. And then sometimes you're not always the best judge of that, I think, because you can look back and be like, "Oh, that thing that I hated was quite good," or like that thing that I showed was awful. You know, you get different perspectives, as you move through, I think. Um, and I think, I wasn't, I didn't, I don't think I really started drawing properly, whatever that is, until I was, 25 or something, I think. I didn't have a really good art education or go to a school with a good art department or anything. I just didn't really I always wanted to do it, but I didn't really learn drawing. I really, really wanted to. And I think because I didn't come to it that much later, but I don't think I really was drawing well until I was in my 20s that I had to really think about drawing a lot, I think. Um, because I really could see that I had this um like lack of skill that I wanted to have. And then I had to work really, really hard at it to get it, like, really obsessively in a way. But I think that's helped me in a way with teaching. So I'm quite aware of what's hard about drawing. So I really remember it, you know. Um,
But a lot of people feel really held back by not having a fine art degree. But I mean, do you feel like that's restricted you in any way? Because I mean, it seems that you've made a really substantial professional practice out of your work without that.
I would say, I don't know, I imagine people who are listening to this are interested in drawing and painting. And I would say that if anyone regrets not having a fine art degree, they probably wouldn't have done a lot of drawing and painting anyway if they had done one. To make a very big generalization, just from my awareness from like various teaching and things of that what fine art actually means now is very much not drawing and painting. Drawing and painting is quite out of fashion really in the contemporary art world. It's kind of coming back in, but it's like especially figurative drawing. Um, so it definitely wouldn't have been for me. And it wasn't a problem for going on the drawing year and things like that. That's much more about portfolio and things. Although I should say part of my funding with Quest, who are funding the training with Terry, is also that they're funding me to do an MA at the Edinburgh College of Art, which I'm doing right now. I've just started, and that's really interesting because that's in a very contemporary art landscape, I guess. So I do feel aware of that. Yeah.
And and is it a good point to start opening things up to the questions of anyone that's here? If anyone did want to ask anything of Meg. You're very welcome, all of you, to put your questions into chat if you'd like to. So if you wanted to type a message to Meg a question, do feel free to put it into the chat to everyone, and we can ask those. We can go through some of those. But I wondered if I could ask you, Meg, about because you've been putting educational resources together for your Patreon and sharing those. And I've been really enjoying them because I've been being nosy and having a peek. And it's lovely having your reflections on drawing and sort of educational processes. And it's also really nice to have something that isn't just pursuing visual accuracy in drawings, but what's your relationship to teaching people to maybe draw with more confidence, but without being formulaic? Is it a kind of clear path for you to be able to kind of present a range of approaches that people can take?
I mean, um, yeah, I think, when you say it, I'm kind of very aware that is a way of teaching which is much more about accuracy. But I think I haven't thought about that way of teaching for so long. I kind of forget it's there. Like I was recently asked to teach a completely different style of teaching for a course someone else had written the lesson plans for, and I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe how rigid it was, and I didn't. I really sort of just got so used to, I suppose, um, my approach, which is, I really see a lot of people coming who would say they're beginners, but actually the first drawings they make, they're sort of the innocence of when you first start drawing again after not having drawn for a while. People really have this like quite unusual, quirky style, and they sort of want you to iron it out, but it's best not to because that's going to be their best thing in a way. So my approach is probably much more about like trying to keep people's like personal, well, obviously, while teaching them like particular approaches and techniques, which I do think are important to teach, and not just say like, oh, just look at it, go away and do it. There's no like rules here. I still um I still think it's really important to kind of maintain people's individual voice, I suppose. And on my Patreon, although that's online, I've tried to create something which is much more about taking people on a journey of trying out different materials and introducing different artists and kind of briefs for people to do, which they can do in their own way rather than like creating a very specific way of drawing, I guess.
Mhm.
Shall I answer some of the questions that are in the chat?
Oh, wait, yeah. Shall I pick some out?
Yes, yeah, yeah, go on.
Just going through because Julie's asked that, saying that obviously she can see Bonnard's influence and just wondered if you could speak about any other artists whose work shows through in your work. Obviously, you were saying Francesca as well.
Yeah, I mean, I always feel a bit, I mean, this is so unfashionable as well in contemporary art practice, which is just that a lot, I do just love a lot of artists from like 20th century and earlier. I mean, I like a lot of contemporary artists as well. Um, but I think, I mean, there's all of those kind of like that era of Bonnard, like all of the Nabis, like Bonnard and Vuillard. I love, the kind of French 20th century painters, I guess. I mentioned Richard Diebenkorn already. Um, I like the landscapes of Mama Anderson, contemporary Swedish painter. Not all of her work, but some of it I find really resonates with mine. Um, and I mean, there's loads of amazing. I've just moved to Scotland. There's so many amazing Scottish painters up here, like Barry McGlashan and Andrew Cranston. And, there's really interesting painting things going on here. Don't know if that's for any particular reason. And yeah, in terms of like, I mean, I'll just go through phases of like looking at different eras and get really into one painter for a while and then, into another. And often it'll be, just like one part of their work. There's painters I love, like say Philip Guston. It's not that I love his work, but I find his spirit very interesting. All of his writing about painting so fascinating. And his early work, which is very inspired by actually also by Piero della Francesca as well, I really love. So sometimes it's like one era of one painter's life in a way.
Mhm. Thank you. I can see Martine's just asked and just said, very atmospheric work. You've moved to Scotland. Does your environment affect your drawings?
Yeah, I think it should more. Sometimes I feel a bit like I'm caught. up in some kind of other landscape that isn't actually where I am.
Mm.
Um, and I think I'm about 2 years like late on letting things creep into my work. And sometimes I think that's not a good thing. Like I ought to be more present. Um, so I think Scotland maybe will creep in, but maybe not quite yet. I don't know. I feel like I'm often, I'm trying to create some kind of landscape that isn't quite real. It's not a real landscape that I'm creating, but it's put together from all of these different motifs. And I mean, the landscape here in Scotland is so beautiful. Like this coast with all the beaches and things actually is. I do find very like I do want to draw and paint it. It's got like pine trees going right down to the sea, and all of these things I find like visually very beautiful. So I think it is having an influence. Yeah, but maybe slowly. I think I'm a slow burner on that for some reason.
I like the idea that perhaps cheetahs might start to inhabit the Scottish landscapes
That'd be
that
great.
meet together. Because do any of those particular animals, those landscapes, kind of come in from sources that you've experienced or kind of lived in,
Um,
or is that?
well, I lived in Italy for 2 years when I was younger, and I think, I mean, I do love the kind of like motifs of like I suppose like the tropes of an Italian landscape.
Mhm.
Um, the particular kind of trees. But I also just love how when you look at Renaissance painting, especially Italian Renaissance painters like Giotto and all the Sienese painters and Piero and so on, you see these trees and then you really see them everywhere in Italy as well. And it's like these little kind of things that haven't changed from like hundreds of years ago, the landscape. These little motifs that have stayed the same, and that's another reason I love to draw trees. Really, they're so timeless. Um, so yeah, I think it all comes in a little bit.
Vanessa's asked a material question and just asked whether you can say something about using poppy oil with graphite, whether you need a particular grade of graphite or type of paper, or whether
Oh,
you can
I
use
mean,
other oils.
you can use linseed oil as well, yeah. But I find linseed oil, it goes through the paper. It's a bit more oily. It kind of goes through the paper a bit more, and it's a bit yellower. For some reason, poppy oil is just a little bit nicer. It's clearer and it's very slow drying. Um, you could use any pencil. I mean, it goes through the paper a bit, so probably slightly thicker paper. But I use it in sketchbooks and things, and it's fine. And you just want to put on a little. You can put on small amounts, and then it's really satisfying. The graphite just kind of goes like paint really. Everything darkens and stays dark as well. Unlike, when you're painting watercolor or something, it lightens when it dries, which can be really frustrating.
That's excitingly appropriate to our term as well, so that would be a nice thing to diffuse out amongst everybody, the idea of using oil with graphite.
Mhm.
Gemini's asked about and just said that they find it difficult to decide when a drawing belongs to a sketchbook or whether it's a final artwork. Yeah, do you find it difficult to make that decision? Is that a decision you feel you have to make?
Yeah, I mean, it's always sad to rip up a sketchbook somehow, isn't it? When you have to tear something out of a sketchbook. I have done though, because I think often your best work's in your sketchbook because it's when you care less about it. You're sort of just, oh, this is just a sketchbook thing, and that's when you set up like a big white canvas and try and do your best work, it doesn't work. So I have taken things out of sketchbooks to show because I'm pleased with them, but it always feels a bit wrong. Like I was saying before, I love the idea of creating like a sketchbook as a whole piece in itself, I think. So yeah, I think it is difficult to know and also difficult to break them apart.
That's it. We just have to wrangle with it.
Yeah.
And Ellie's asked whether you have a favorite subject to draw and why that would be.
Um, I mean, it's probably trees. I love to draw trees. Like if I was just gonna whenever I'm walking around, constantly see trees and then go, "I wanna draw that," but I'm always with my, like, kids and I never can. But I should just make some time to go out and draw trees. Especially this time of year, it's so beautiful, all the colours and things, and I always regret I never have time to properly, like, look at autumn, I suppose, yeah.
And I think we'll finish off with the last few questions. And I've got to say, Meg, this has been the most perfectly timed of our talks we've ever had. You've been bang on throughout. I, I,
Thanks.
Very organized. Renee's asked whether we could hear a bit more about your MA and I guess looking into the future about the direction of whether your work's going to take a different direction and whether it's going to involve drawing, because obviously there's sort of printmaking involved as well. So where's your MA headed at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I feel honestly so lucky to be doing it. Like I wouldn't have done it unless I'd got the funding, and it's like amazing to be a student again. The Edinburgh College of Art is really beautiful. Like, it's like still got all of the plaster statues everywhere. It's very like, it's been there for years and it's steeped in all different artists who've been through there. And I just really like the atmosphere there. Um, I mean, I don't know how familiar people are with like the kind of arts education landscape now in higher education, but the MA is called Contemporary Art Practice, and it's like not drawing and painting. Like they're fine with me doing it because I, like, you can do what you want, but I definitely it's unusual to be drawing and painting, and I have a slight feeling that it's constantly seen as like a bit old-fashioned, which it probably is, or it probably is seen as that. So I'll be drawing and painting and printmaking on it mostly, and especially because the funding was for printmaking, I'll be doing a lot of etching, which I'm really excited about using the etching studio there. But it is interesting. It's quite interesting to be there in this context of you know, there's a lot of conceptual sculpture and video installation, performance art, time-based work, and all that kind of thing. It's quite interesting finding drawings place within that, I guess.
Mhm. Thank you. And a couple of really practical questions. So Paulette's asked what job you did before becoming an artist.
I worked with young people. I worked for Bernardo's for a long time. So like youth work stuff, which was really good. Yeah.
And a final question, or actually, I've got one to add in at the end, but uh, they've had one question about whether you had any advice to other artists, I presume, about selling work or making a living from your work as a practicing artist.
I mean, I think my main bit of advice really is to work on your work for as long as you can, because that becomes the most important thing, I think, to have like work that you've really found your voice with. And I think when you've done that, that helps a lot with everything else. Um, I mean, it's such a minefield. It is for me as well, like how much time to spend on promotion, all these, and you've got to do all of it if you're an artist, really, don't you? But I always think it's so important to not let anything get in the way of like really keeping up like a sustained practice, because the work will speak for itself if you do that.
That's great advice. Thank you. And I have a very silly final question, Meg, as it is our graphite term. What is your favourite grade of pencil, please?
Yeah, I saw that you'd asked that on one of the other videos, and I was thinking, I think I'm going to go 6B.
Oh,
Yeah.
I called it. I was thinking of 6B.
What's yours?
Fantastic. Uh, oh God, I'm not prepared to answer that question. That's too much.
Oh, go on, you've
Going
got to
too
commit.
deep. I mean, I could go. I'm probably going to go 4B, which feels almost cowardly in response to
Yeah.
your 6B. So.
Well, we'll wait for someone to go 9B.
Okay. Well, we'll see. I mean, we'll see what Sina says next month. Um, Meg, thank you so much. It's been such a delight. It's been a real pleasure to
Yeah,
have
thank
you.
you for inviting me. Yeah, and thanks everyone for coming.
For everyone that has come along tonight, I'm going to share the recording from this video on our YouTube. So if you want to come back to it, there'll be the opportunity to do that. But I would really recommend having a look at Meg's work on Instagram, on her website. Also, if you're looking for educational resources around drawing, I would really recommend Meg's Patreon. I'm a supporter, and there's some really exciting reflections.
Jay, thanks for sharing that for me. Appreciate
It's really seriously, it's a wonderful resource, and I think we're really lucky to have artists sharing sort of very generously the resource they have. So thank you, Meg, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, yeah, it's been great. Yeah, and yeah, I look forward to watching the other talks. They've all been really interesting. The ones I've watched so far.
Oh, I think we've got some good stuff coming up. We've got Sina Jovi, who's going to be our next graphite term artist, but that's actually just going to be at the very beginning of December. So rather than the end of November, it'll be the first Friday of December, everybody. So it'll be lovely to see you all there if you can make it for that. Otherwise, that'll bring us to the end of tonight. So thank you again, Meg. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. Bye, everyone.
If you've enjoyed this talk and want to be kept up to date on more of our programme, or you want to support what we do, you can find more details at patreon.com/Draw Brighton.